Also joining us in the studio, delighted to say, Lord Frost. David Frost is a Conservative peer, also a former Cabinet Office Minister and, of course, a former Chief Brexit negotiator. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us. Another quiet August, nothing much to chat about. There's lots I want to get to you to talk about. But first of all, it's just, we mentioned it on the show yesterday, a tweet that you put out in response to a statement put out by someone who, frankly, I'd never heard of, would have never heard of, needed to know about in my life, European Commissioner Thierry Breton, who's the European Union's top digital enforcer. I know, I didn't know either that was a thing. But he wrote an extraordinary letter to Elon Musk ahead of his streamed interview with Donald Trump on X, formerly Twitter, and basically said, you know, you've got to be careful about spreading harmful content, and was basically threatening to censor an organisation that is run from another country over an interview run in another country involving a political candidate with no legal oversight from the EU. But this threat is a very real threat, isn't it? So explain what he actually wants to do.
So the EU have passed this law, the Digital Services Act, that purports to give them the power to block, as they see it, harmful or dangerous or whatever content within the European Union.
And who gets to decide what's harmful?
Well, precisely, that's one of the problems. So, I mean, the odd thing about this was that, in a way, Thierry Breton was within his rights to write this letter in terms of EU law. They do have these powers. Quite how they would make them work is a different question.
Well, it's one thing having those powers over the EU.
Yeah.
But why does he think he has those powers over X in America?
So I think what he was saying was the right to either fine X or block it in future or censor it in future. And in theory, they've given themselves the power to do this. Now, those of us who spend a lot of time talking to the EU know they make heavy-handed threats quite often. And indeed, he's got into trouble with his own boss, it seems, for making this threat.
Which is
nevertheless, you know, they seem to have the power to do it. He's just made it a bit too obvious.
Yes. Well, also, I mean, it's electoral interference. So it's an interview by Elon Musk with, well, it's a cosy fireside chat, really, wasn't it? With a potential former American president and Republican candidate for the presidency in America for this November. So it's an outrageous thing to interview with anyway. But also this notion that, you know, the X is spreading all this harmful content. We've had a lot of talk since the Southport attacks and the riots about the responsibility of social media, and it's not just Twitter, X, whichever we're calling it this week. There's other social media, rather less policed, you say. But somehow social media is responsible for someone grabbing a brick and lobbing it at a police officer, or or setting fire to a van, or running amok. I mean, do you think social media companies are responsible for that, or people's tweets, even politicians? Nigel Farage, Reform UK leader, has been accused of being responsible.
I mean, it's all part of a ridiculous moral panic, in my view. I mean, anyone would think we never had riots before social media was invented. People will always find ways of communicating with each other if that's what they want to do. Now, I think a lot of these riots were criminal in nature, and
a lot of the people who got convicted so far have actually got a string of offences.
Absolutely,
already.
And I have no difficulty in the authorities clamping down on violence and some of the things we've seen on our streets. But what this is being used as an excuse for, or it seems to me it's being used as an excuse for, is to extend speech controls on social media and elsewhere, and that is a real problem because we have quite extensive speech controls already in this country, and there, as we've seen, there have been a few cases of them being used in this way. I don't want to see them go any further.
I'd like them to be rolled back. Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. And especially, it's one thing, isn't it? I'm sure we'd all agree, any sane person would agree, that people who, you know, get violence or incite violence or threaten violence to people, behave in that intimidating way in public, or write violent threats on social media, that they should be prosecuted.
Of course.
But other people who have just simply, you know, passed on information that turned out to be wrong, businesswoman Bernie Spofforth, I've mentioned her on all three shows so far this week, are also, you know, facing prison terms.
It's a criminal offence in this country under the Online Safety Act to make a false communication That's the law that we have passed. So the only question
by the way,
is...
the Conservative government that you supported...
I know, I
yeah.
opposed that bill, and many of us did, but unfortunately it went
But hold
through.
on, why aren't we able to prosecute the government for all the lies? Look, you resigned from Boris Johnson's government over lockdown and over, various other issues that you were unhappy about. We were told numerous lies. I mean, and I don't mean we didn't know at the time things about COVID and about masks and lockdowns and things like that. I don't mean, well, now we know better. I mean, at the time, they made statements that they knew. We've seen from Matt Hancock's WhatsApps that they knew were not evidence-based, they knew were untrue, and they did it anyway. Why are none of those people prosecuted?
Well, this illustrates exactly why it's so dangerous, that most of the misinformation, as far as I can see in our public debate, comes from the government, and we saw a lot of it, or from the public authorities, not from individuals.
Keir Starmer tells us that some women have penises.
Yeah, I mean, all this sort of stuff.
That's a blatant piece of disinformation.
The Chinese lab leak, whether the vaccines prevented transmission or not. There are lots of cases of things where it turned the original party line turned out to be wrong, and that's why it's so dangerous.
But they knew it was wrong. No, but they knew it was wrong when they said it.
Yes, or they knew it was at least a legitimate thing to debate. That's why it's so dangerous to go down this road.
Absolutely, and again, it's a notion of legal but harmful content. Well, if it's legal, and we do have a fundamental principle in law in this country, don't we? Which is, unless it is specifically prohibited by law made by democratically elected, accountable MPs in Parliament, unless it is specifically prohibited, you're allowed to do it. There isn't a default if you can't do it unless the government said it's okay. The default is you could do whatever you want as long as it's not against the law. But that's quite a different way of looking at our relationship with the state, isn't it?
That's how we traditionally looked at things in this country. I don't know how true it really is now, to be honest, given how many laws we've passed. For example, it is an offence to send a grossly offensive message in this country.
Well,
it is
don't
a
look at my
criminal
WhatsApps.
offence. Well, precisely. But people have been given prison sentences for private WhatsApps. It's the only thing that protects you is the authorities' willingness or otherwise to prosecute you. It is an offence.
There's an awful lot of people, and we know this from the stats in terms of the number of Conservatives who either switched to Reform, some to Labour, but actually a large number of them just sat at home and said, I'm just not prepared to vote for any of you lot. But the number of Tory voters from 2019 who I've spoken to who've just said before the election, do you know what? I don't want to vote for this lot. I definitely don't want to vote for Keir Starmer's lot. But you know what? How much worse can they be? We've had a Labour-light government for the last few years anyway. So what difference does it make? And I was kind of that view as well. I'm getting scared now. What has been said and done since Keir Starmer has come to power and the plans that they have suggest to me that we are heading towards new levels of authoritarianism. Do you fear what's going to happen over the next 5 years?
I do fear it now. I was a bit like you before the election.
He's a Conservative peer.
But what I've seen in terms of the clampdown in recent weeks, plus other things, the rolling back of the education reforms, the throwing public money around and claiming that we did it, all this sort of thing, just in a month, just in 6 weeks, a lot of things have been reversed, a new course has been set, and I'm really worried about it. Of course, what it does show is that when a government wants to do something, it can do something, and I wish the Conservative government had a bit more of that spirit. One
of the main reasons I think a lot of people were unhappy with the Conservative government was they talked a good game, but they never actually did the actual deeds to get things happening in real life. One of the key things that this government says they want to do is deliver growth. But we've got these latest stats out yesterday about worklessness among British adults. At 9.4 million economically inactive 16 to 64-year-olds. It's up 350,000 in just a year, when there are a huge number of vacancies, up 1 million since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. Look, some of these are students, some of these are looking after kids, some have taken early retirement. Again, that's already an issue, and people, how many decades do you plan to be retired? But we're looking also at 2.8 million people long-term sick. It's a record high. A lot of those are mental health related, stress, anxiety. Used to be backache. That was the back problems, wasn't it? But basically, these are things which are, to all intents and purposes, unmeasurable objectively unmeasurable. What do you make of this, and how do we get Workshire Britain back to work?
Well, it is a big problem, and I don't believe that all of a sudden there's these sort of massive epidemics across the country. I think all these things are about incentives. Now, undoubtedly, some people can't work for whatever reason. There's no doubt about that. But I worry our debate has shifted too far in one direction. We talk entirely about helping people back into work, and you know, maybe that's a good thing. But also, there's a bit of, if you don't work, then that's a problem for you, and you should work. And, you know, we need a bit more of stick, I think, as well as carrot.
Yes. Yes, right. Everything we've heard from Rachel Reeves and other cabinet ministers has been about this sort of helping, encouraging. Here's what's going to encourage you. You're not going to be able to afford your rent or your food this week. Funnily enough, you know that little advert for a job, you're going to have to turn up. And we're often told by these people that people don't want to employ Brits because they've got bad attitude, they're work shy, they're not. But you know what? Yeah, at some point you're going to have to put a smile on your face and do the job.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And
does this make us terribly old-fashioned?
It probably does nowadays, doesn't it? I mean, the culture is... We do have this culture of sort of dwelling on your problems and weaknesses, and, you know, when that's the environment, then you tend to get overcome by them. And, you know, as public policy, we should be trying to push in the other direction. You are capable. You can work.
Here's what you can
Go out
do.
And do it.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. I mean, look, we know that immigration plays a big part in this. It's been, you know, employers basically saying we can't get Brits to work, so they haven't got the skills. We're bringing in people from abroad, and stats we talked about on the show yesterday, more Nigerians and Indians have taken new jobs than Brits. And I mean, it's an astonishing statistic. No criticism of the people who've travelled from overseas to come and take those jobs and do those jobs. All credit to them, you know, upping sticks, moving their families, trying to have a better life. But that's clearly unsustainable long term. What do you make of what Richard Tice, Reform UK's deputy leader, speaking to Mike Graham on Talk this morning? He said that he says the Labour government wants to suppress debate around discussing immigration, and he would like a referendum on immigration so we could actually have a proper debate about it. What do you make of that?
Well, I do think that referendums could be a bit more used in our political system, particularly when
Switzerland has one every year.
Exactly. I think it encourages thought and responsibility about political debate, probably, as people get used to it. I think, I mean, obviously we aren't going to get a referendum in the next 4 or 5 years, that's clear. We are going to get more immigration because that's what the Labour Party wants. I do think that, you know, one of the problems on immigration has been that even if the government wants to cut it, a lot of the sort of deep state, legal establishment, NGO world doesn't.
Yep.
And I think maybe, you know, if you've got a government that wants to do it and can put a set of propositions to the people, we want to cut immigration to this level, do you back us to do everything that's necessary to do it? That's the sort of circumstance, maybe.
You could argue, could you?